And welcome back, Fourth and Long fans. It's your footy correspondent, Coach Donnie Hess here, back with another off-season supporter series chat. Ladies and gentlemen, we got to get back to March for the AFL season. So let's fill footy with supporter chats, finding out about sides, AFL, VFL, Sandful, and Waffle. Let's find out who we got today. I have Tim coming to me from Melbourne. Tim, thank you for joining me today, sir.
Thanks for having me, and good to finally chat to you.
Awesome, awesome. Yeah, we connected on Twitter. It's been fantastic chit-chatting with you, footy and all different sorts, including giving me tips on how to make a good Aussie meat pie. I thoroughly thank you for that, sir. But before we get into the footy and everything like that, I kind of like to find out just a little bit about the person behind the footy team and the person I'm chatting with away from the football field. So just a little bit about yourself outside of the game of football.
Yeah, so it's when people ask me outside of the game of football, it's hard because it takes up so much of my time and my life
Mhm.
growing up in a very passionate family. So I do get into the American football in our off season because it sort of matches up perfectly. I coach a local gridiron team here in Melbourne too. I'm a defensive coordinator for a team as well. So that takes up so much time when it comes to outside of footy. But yeah, on top of that, I just get into a bit of music, bit of art and photography stuff as well. So I just sort of like a shotgun to spread everywhere. And
You have your fingers in plenty of pies. Pardon the pun here for sure. We will definitely go off that. So let's go to it. I love the game of footy. I fell in love with it as a kid. Really jumped headfirst into it in 2009 when I started playing locally here. So I gotta ask, as a Melburnian, as a person that's grown up with it, what is your favorite thing about the sport of football?
there's just so much of it. So it's just ingrained in Melbourne culture. So there's a point where if anyone starts a new job or you hear this new person starting at your company, everyone will say, but what team do they follow? Because Melbourne has got 10 teams
Mhm.
that are based in here at the moment. And because we're such the way Melbourne's expanded back in the old days, there used to be zones and sections where people would just mainly follow one team. But now, as the outer suburbs, because I sort of live outer suburb, it's become much more of a melting pot. So it's just the tribalness of it, being able to get along with people at work who might follow a different team. You have a lot of just like friendly bets with each other. Just the whole culture of it. Just everyone knows what it's like to get public transport into the city and walk into the MCG before a big game. Like it's just the feeling of that is something that I've never been able to match anywhere else.
Yeah, it's really hard to go away from that because it is such a different it's tribal, but it's not as bad as say the world football. Like it's not where you have to be
Mm,
separated. I've noticed that even amongst Carlton and Collingwood fans, there's a realm of respect. There's distaste, but there is an outright hatred. Like the world game sometimes always has. So I gotta give footy that is that at least there is some mutual respect usually between some teams. Sometimes some not, but then again, no, there's always dickheads in every single fan base. So we always kind of try to
yeah.
ignore them. So let's go back into your memory, sir. Can you remember what is your earliest footballing memory?
So like I said, I grew up in a very crazy football family. My parents actually met by going to the AFL together,
Mhm.
not so much the Port Melbourne side of things. So I started going every Saturday from when they took me in a bassinet to some home games. So my earliest football memory is just it was always there. But I do specifically remember attending AFL games really young and meeting my favorite player at the side of the home ground at the time, which was because I was used to him being this big from my seats, and I was about
Mhm.
3 or 4 years old. And when I met him, he was very tall bear with a very deep voice, and he signed my jumper, but it was very terrifying. I guess is my earliest football memory. So
That
it's
is
not
that is
really.
awesome. Can you remember the player? What's the player's name?
Yeah, it was Stephen Kernahan.
Awesome, Kernahan. That's a good one. Yeah, definitely a very solid player there. So anybody that's watching the YouTube video that knows their VFL, they know by the colors what club that you support, and you might have tipped it just the littlest bit, but can you tell us what club are we talking about today?
So I do support Port Melbourne in the VFL. That goes back generations in my family. My mum's side of the family as far back as we can trace, from Port Melbourne. So that's late 1800s. The club was founded
That's
in 1874, and we've been there ever since.
awesome. That is awesome. So it's a family reason that you still support it. That's awesome. Was there anybody that I know with VFL it's kind of changed because you have the AFL reserves sides that have kind of taken over, but has there been anybody in the family that's kind of been the outcast that decided to support a different club, or is it one of those that they stayed Port Melbourne to stay in the family?
So everyone in the family is Port Melbourne when it comes to the VFL level. They always have been. So going back pre 1990s, the VFL was called the VFA, and it used to only be played on Sundays. And the AFL was called the VFL, and it was only played on Saturdays. So you'd have people would go follow their VFL club, and then they'd
Hmm.
go Sunday and follow their VFA club. So there was never any crossover there. So everyone sort of had a VFL and a VFA club at that point in time. And my family's always been Port Melbourne. My great grandma passed away when I was 14. So I grew up with her, visiting her place, and she'd be sitting on the couch watching Port Melbourne on the TV. And I'd sit there next to her sometimes and watch some of their games on TV too, because it's quite a journey to get into Port Melbourne from where I actually live. And when I'm young and can't drive, I'm at obviously the mercy of where my parents will take me.
Hmm.
So that was all the Port Melbourne I had growing up, was I'd follow the scores in the newspaper and see they won, and I'd just see them on TV occasionally when I was with my nan.
Awesome, awesome. So a little bit again, I don't have that history with it. So could you tell me just a little bit of the history of Port Melbourne? You said as 1874 that they got started. So kind of how they got their nickname, their colors, just a little bit of the history that you know of Port Melbourne.
Yeah, so going all the way back to the origins of organized football here, the original competition was big competition here was the BFA, which is what Geelong and Melbourne, the two oldest clubs, started competing in back in the 1850s. In 1864, you had a few bigger teams join, like Carlton ended up joining, a few teams like that. Then by 1874, you had Port Melbourne had joined, and you started to have all these clubs just popping up everywhere.
Hmm.
Then there was sort of the haves and the have-nots. So the richer clubs were against equalisation methods, and the poorer clubs wanted to support them because they thought that's how you grow the league. And eventually, they split in 1897. Was the first season that the VFL became its own thing, and 8 clubs left the VFA to join the VFL. Port Melbourne was the top 6, like best team for a long period of time before that, but they weren't invited to join the VFL. There's a few theories on it. One is because Port Melbourne supported equalisation methods, which the other clubs are trying to get away from. Another
Hmm.
one is Port Melbourne had a reputation for being a very rough area, and the players and supporters were poorly behaved at times. So they didn't want that riffraff in their new competition. So since then, Port Melbourne's been the best VFA club by far. They've won 17 premierships in their years since I think they won their first one just after 1897. And in 1925, the VFA tried to get more teams across to the VFL because that was turning into clearly being the better competition. And the Port Melbourne put their hand up to join in that sort of time period, but they were once again knocked back for the same reasons as before. So the poor behaviour at the grounds and
Hmm.
stuff like that. So the VFL elected to bring in Hawthorn instead. So Hawthorn took our spot.
Oh boy, so that's probably pretty interesting. A great story, and almost is it almost a little bit like kind of how they describe Collingwood fans a little bit with the kind of feral attitude, or is it just almost like nefarious activities?
So there's a couple of stories. My mum hates Port Melbourne being compared to Collingwood because she doesn't like Collingwood at all. So it's sort of
Hmm.
because she's Port Melbourne as well. She just used to go to games as a little girl, but not so much as an adult because the AFL took up all their
Hmm.
time and energy, plus trying to raise 2 kids. So yeah, there's one incident I read a newspaper clipping from in the 1950s was after a bad free kick decided a game against Port Melbourne at the Port Melbourne ground. The umpires had to try and escape the crowd before the crowd could get on the field and get to them because at suburban grounds there's very little security,
Hmm.
if any, at all. And the crowd eventually got to the umpires, and the police had to come and try and separate them. And then when the cop car came to take away a few people who had been misbehaving in the back of the cop car, the crowd surrounded the cop car, and a woman pretended to faint in front of the cop car. When the cops got out to see if she was okay, they broke the two guys out of the back seat and snapped the radio antenna off the car so they couldn't radio in for help. That's the
Jeez. Wow, what a story. Oh, the olden days. Oh, the olden days
yep.
for sure. That is insane. That is a crazy story. And the funny part about it is there's whether it's true or not, it'll always be up for legend, but it's one that you'll want to keep on for sure. So we'll go back to a little bit more present time. Can you remember the first ever Port Melbourne item that you were given or bought?
Yeah, so the first item I remember getting was one I bought. I went to a game when I got my license and could drive myself in. I decided to just start going to games after watching them on TV and following them for so long. And at a game, they used to sell secondhand jerseys. And there was one there that was medium, which is not my size. I'm a large, but it would just fit because I was very skinny at that point in time.
Mhm.
And I managed to squeeze it on. It had the number 69 on the back, and I just paid for that on the spot. And I wore that for years and years to games. Yeah, and I just got scarves and stuff like that. And yeah, I've still got it actually. I own a fair few jerseys now, and that's the first one I got. So that'll always be there and hanging up in the closet with the rest of them.
Always the great memory ones. I 100% absolutely love that. So the next question that I'm going to go to, I love it because it's always interesting to hear people describe how they fan, because I think to fan or support is always different amongst everybody. There's no perfect fan. There's no one way to fan. There's no another way. I would classify myself as a diehard, but I've even heard diehard said as a negative connotation. So is there any way you could describe to me your fandom? Is it one of those that you have to see every game that you can? If you can't watch it, you'll listen to it on the radio. Kind of describe to me your fandom of Port Melbourne.
It's very passionate. Um, it's it's hard because with the VFL coverage, it's been poor. There used to be one game a week that was televised. So if you weren't there, there was no way to know what happened
Mhm.
aside from checking Facebook updates. So there was a couple of years where I worked a lot of Saturdays. So for those games, I would just check the Facebook updates while I'm meant to be working as well, just to see who would win. But I go every game I could. There was a period of time as well where I moved out to regional Victoria. So I was living about 100 Ks further out from where I am now. So
Mhm.
150 Ks kilometres away from the grounds, which is about 100 miles. And I'd still drive in every weekend to go watch Port Melbourne play as well. So just devoted, I guess.
That's hey, there's each and every fan is different. I love hearing the different stories and how everybody fans. Absolutely fantastic. So we go to this next one, and as you said, you grew up and it wasn't there wasn't always a lot of coverage, especially in the early days. Can you remember the first Port Melbourne game you attended?
I pretty sure it was against another standalone club. I want to say it was Werribee.
Mhm.
I remember going and I just remember the day it was overcast. It wasn't particularly warm, but it wasn't exactly a very cold day. And it was early in the 2010, 2011 season, actually, I think was the first game I went to. So I think I missed all the 2010 ones. And I remember we won and I bought my jumper. And that's pretty much after that, it just sort of faded into the ether of games that I attended throughout that year because that was a very good year for us. We went through undefeated that year and won our first grand final since about 1982.
Yeah, awesome. That's fantastic to know that when you really got into it. So this is always an interesting one for me because I know I've asked this question, and for some people it's like choosing your favorite child. Do you have a favorite player of the past, and do you have a favorite player currently on the Port Melbourne list?
So, of the past, when I started going, I really took to a player called Chris Kane, and he was a real nice guy. I had the opportunity to speak to him a couple of times as well. I actually even have a photo of myself after we won the 2017 grand final back at the club rooms holding up the cup with him. So that was pretty special. I just loved the way he played. He was a bit shorter in stature, so the way he used to break out of the crowd with the ball and just nail goals from about 50, 45 on the run, right when it always seemed to be right when we really needed him to. And it was just real fun watching him play. I also really enjoyed Toby Pinwell, who captained us to the 2017 Premiership as well. Of the past, I guess they count as the past. But growing up, I heard a lot about Freddie Cook. He's the legend of Port Melbourne. He played through the 70s and 60s, and yeah, he leading goal kicker. I got to meet him a couple times as well. That was a privilege before he sadly passed away recently. And my current favorite player would be Eli Templeton, but he had that injury this year where he was playing. He went down to locals to play with some friends, and he got bumped over a fence and hit his head on the concrete. So I haven't heard an update in a little while. I know he was going to recover, but I just still really like that guy and wishing the best for him.
Oh, that's hard. That's in There's not that much you can do about that, unfortunately. So my thoughts out to him. So, well, unfortunately, we go from kind of a sad moment to let's go to a great moment. Let's get one. Let's make us smile a little bit. Let's pick it back up here. Most memorable moment as a Port Melbourne supporter.
So I watch a lot of sport, a lot of different teams, AFL, VFL, American football, but my favorite sporting moment ever that I've ever experienced, and I don't think anything will ever live up to the hype of it again, was in 2017 when Port Melbourne managed to win that grand final. There was a moment where at the start of the season we were up against it for funding, and a few players actually took no money for the first few weeks just so the club could be viable for that year. And we ended up struggling through all year and only just making it into the finals. And then we were underdogs for the first few weeks of finals, and we managed to just pull off wins. We make it into the grand final, and the 24-minute mark. Obviously, watching AFL at the game, you don't know how long's left because the timer counts up. So 24-minute mark, we're down by just under 3 goals, and you start to that sinking feeling of we've come all this way and we've dropped it. We managed to get 2 really quick goals, and we're back in it. There's excitement. Everyone's up and about. The best moment, getting to the best moment after setting all that context, was Mitch Wolfenden gathered a loose ball and snapped it round his body from about 30 out to kick the goal that put us in front, which ended up, the game came down to a kick after the siren, and Richmond missed, and we won the grand final because of it. And just every time I see that footage of Mitch Wolfenden kicking that goal, it still gives me chills because I remember being there and I could not believe it had happened. So that I think that is not just my favorite Port Melbourne memory, but that is the greatest sporting moment I've seen.
Oh, always having the chance to win a premiership is always a great memory. Completely agree with that one. Love it. So, again, with the VFL, it's a little bit different. I mean, I think with a lot of AFL fans, it's like we have the draft, you have the off-season sign and trade period. So the VFL is a little bit different. It really is kind of, it doesn't, you don't have the draft. You kind of are going off of the listings of AFL squads. So has Port Melbourne done anything in the offseason? Or do you keep an eye on the offseason moves that Port Melbourne does? And have you heard of any new players coming into the Port Melbourne side next year?
So you are right with VFL; it's very different. They just go out and they grab a lot of people as well. They also not only AFL listings, they grab 18 because our 18-year-olds go to the draft to go play AFL, and anyone who doesn't get drafted or picked up there goes and trains with either AFL clubs or VFL sides. So there's this big balloon of incoming players that do trainings and stuff. So it is very hard to keep track of VFL stuff. I do read about signings and all the rest of it. Special mention to there's a guy I'm working for at the moment at a bakery, and his son's trying out for Port Melbourne currently, and
Awesome.
he's been cut down to the final last little bit of things, so he actually might make it onto their list this year. So I do try and keep an eye on it, but over the years I've learnt to not until it gets closer to March when you start, because
Mhm.
otherwise there's way too many names being thrown around, and then at March I sort of go, all right, the list is starting to get settled. Let's see what's changed, because there's the regulars that are there every year and you
Mhm.
get to know them and love them, and then there's like the bottom 6 that sort of swap in and out regularly.
Mhm.
So if you try, you'll pull your hair out trying to keep up with all the names in December, but yeah, by February, March, then I start reading a bit more about it.
Very true. And on all of that, I was trying to be sure. I wanted to check something really quickly on my iPad here, real quick. I forgot to ask, how was Port Melbourne season last year? Kind of your thoughts on last year's season, because I had to go through because I hadn't had a chance to look at some of the teams here. So I see, unfortunately, they did not have probably as good a year. They finished 16th on the table this year with 7 wins, 11 losses, only 28 points. So kind of your thoughts on Port Melbourne this year. Again, not making finals, and again the VFL, it's kind of how do the AFL sides, what comes down, what doesn't. So you kind of have to
Yeah,
go with it, unfortunately.
yeah. So this season was the first season that wasn't COVID affected after
Mhm.
a couple of years. And unfortunately, you had a lot of VFL, top level VFL players leave the state to go play in the Waffle, the Sandful, up north in the Northern Territory where COVID wasn't an issue. So they could get paid for playing out there because you do get paid for playing at VFL level.
Mhm.
But without going into too much of a tangent, the AFL, in my opinion, has neglected the VFL a lot because they don't want people attending VFL games. They want eyes on the AFL product for the advertisers and the money and whatnot. So they've sort of turned it into a Mickey Mouse competition last year for the standalone clubs. So if you look at the ladder, you'll notice that they're pretty much all AFL affiliated clubs that make up the top
Mhm.
half of that ladder
Yep.
because there was restrictions put on. There was age restrictions put in on standalone clubs and salary cap reduction. They have changed some of that for this upcoming season, so it should be an improvement to try and bring it back down. But I was happy with it. Was we had a first year new coach really going through his first full season, and I think he did well. He learned as the season went on. A few players stepped up. Overall, while like you said, we didn't get into finals, which is obviously what you want to do. But considering the handicaps put on standalone clubs, I feel like we had a very positive year and took some steps forward.
Yeah, it makes sense. And looking at it, Southport is the only team that's a standalone that actually made the eight. So that's
Yeah,
pretty.
and having said that, just with Southport, when they because they just recently joined New South Wales, Queensland, and the VFL together into one competition, and some
Mhm.
of the Queensland clubs went under because they or left the competition
Mhm.
because they didn't want to deal with all that travel. So their top end players went to Southport. So Southport is a super standalone club, not just. It's like if Williamstown and Werribee went down and they all went to Port Melbourne.
Makes sense. Yeah, because I think because they're up in Queensland, they're up in Queensland, as you said. Yeah, so
Yeah, they're
I was
on the
I was
Gold
I was, I
Coast.
was wondering about that because I saw that there's 21 teams. It was like odd that there's an odd number. Normally, most of them, especially with buy rounds and things like that, they usually have even numbers, so then they don't have to worry about it. Yeah, thank you for that. So now reversing, so we've finished one season, we jumped over the off season previously before. So as you said, you kind of mentioned this a little bit too, is with the changes to the VFL a little bit this year. Do you think expectations again is a word that I don't like expectations because I think it says that I expect something. So what are your thoughts for next season? Do you think you see a bump? Do you think you see Port vying potentially for a final spot, or do you think it's going to be another year of a lot of the AFL sides being the finals teams and still some of the standalones kind of getting themselves back into contention?
Yeah, I feel like next season will be a bit better than the previous one. I think there is an opportunity now for some of the stronger standalone clubs to maybe push their way into the bottom half of that eight, especially if some close results go their way. And so it's the standalone clubs are doing well, trying to make their games against each other mean more, which is what they sort of need to do to capitalize on that. So I'm looking for improvement this year. I'm really hoping that they can take that next step forward from last year. That'll be really good to see because the last thing you want to do is see a team tread water. I reckon we could win a couple more games, and most importantly, I just hope we can beat Williamstown again. So I can't stand
That's
losing to Williamstown.
and that's your biggest rival, Williamstown.
Yes, yeah, that's. I've got a badge which I should have actually brought it. It says I hate Williamstown that I wear to the Williamstown games.
I meant to put it in my list of questions that I know with the standalones. Like I always wanted to know, like who's your biggest rival? Who's the one that you always look forward to? And I meant to
Yeah,
do it in a previous state league episode and totally forgot. So I'm definitely going to make sure that I get that question in there. That your biggest rival. Just to hear the thoughts on that. So and
yeah.
again, as we said, VFL is a little bit different, but I'm gonna let you have a little bit of fun with this. I'm gonna install you as the Port Melbourne list manager. And out of all the VFL clubs that you have open, is there one player that you would bring to Port Melbourne and why?
It's a toss up, I think, between two particular players. One is because I think there's this weird grey area of too good for VFL but not good enough for
Hmm.
AFL, and it could come down to speed, size, anything like that, because you just
Hmm.
might not be able to put on that meat to compete with the big boys at AFL. But I really like Paddy Dow from Carlton. I think he's really good decision maker, and he's got the skills. But I don't know if his body type is the right one to make it at AFL
Hmm.
level. So I think he'd be a dangerous weapon to have in Port Melbourne, especially if Eli Templeton doesn't end up coming back, because sort of unsure what will happen there. There'll be that sort of speedster role that could be filled. And he plays the same sort of style as Chris Kane, who I mentioned earlier, who I really liked as well. So it'd be exciting to see that. But the other player I toss up between, if he, for whatever reason, was to be cut from his AFL list because he has spent a bit of time in the VFL the last sort of 18 months, just purely because it'd be eyes on the football club and more media attention and plus we need someone down there. But I would love to see Mason Cox come across. It will
That
just
is
get
awesome.
yeah, like he seems like a real nice guy. He's a big, tall power forward. If he wants to come down and play VFL when his AFL career is over, I'd love to see him at Port Melbourne. He'd bring eyes and attention on the club as well. So it's win-win-win, I think. So
That'd be fantastic.
that'd be the two players I'd chase.
Awesome, awesome. That'd be fantastic. In fact, actually, this last year at USAFL Nationals, I actually got to introduce myself and shake his hand. And holy crap, that guy's hands are huge. Like I
Oh,
shook
he's
his hand and
massive.
my hand disappeared. I was like, okay. So it was very, very interesting.
He's a
But
very big boy.
he's long and lean. Like that's the one thing.
Yeah.
The camera does exactly show him. Like sometimes you see superstars and it doesn't show you the gravitas of that. Like there's athletes in some sports that you see him live and you're like, holy shnikes, they're bigger
Yeah.
than you thought they were. He is exactly like you see him. He is just long and lean.
When he
Like
puts his
there's
arms up, it's just he
yeah.
looks like a stretched.
Oh yeah. He looks like a palm tree. It's absolutely fantastic. It's absolutely great. So, but that was a fun little moment for me. So, anybody that listens to my podcast knows I am a huge advocate for women's footy. I think women's footy is something that honestly, if you put the money into it, I think the product is going to get better and better and better. Does Port Melbourne have a VFL side? And do you keep track of that VFLW side as well?
Yes, we do. Same thing. I watched the results. I think I attended 2 games last year. When they're double headers, it makes it real easy to go in watch the VFLW side and the VFL or vice versa, depending on which way it goes. It's hard with the VFLW and AFLW because they've expanded the competition so quickly. I think there's a talent issue just trying to hold people in certain clubs without moving them around as well. So it is a bit hard, but I think I really like what Port Melbourne's done with their VFLW program. Um, yeah, it's really good just to see the girls getting out there and having fun. From our first game, I think it was only 3 years ago or 2 years ago, they got absolutely hammered by a team, and by the end of the year they were getting close and they even won a game. And since then, now they've been competitive most of the time. So it's real fun to watch a whole new program being brought up and developed, and yeah, these people get an opportunity to come in and compete at a level that wasn't available to them previously.
Awesome, awesome. So we'll get to it. We'll get to it. It's hard not to. I mean, we talk VFL, and again, the VFL and the AFL sometimes can have fights of words, especially with somebody like yourself that has a standalone club. But do you have an AFL side? Who is it? And then do you also sport the AFLW side that club has?
Yeah, so I do. So my childhood and growing up was Carlton. I'm a massive Carlton fan. As I mentioned, from when I was a baby in a bassinet, my parents would drive 3 hours from a country town every weekend with me to go watch Carlton play at Princes Park before they moved back down to Melbourne. So I grew up every week. It was like in my house. My parents were so crazy about it that if I had to stay at a friend's house on the Friday night, they'd pick me up Saturday morning before the football. So because you couldn't miss it, you just didn't miss
That's
football.
awesome.
Yeah, so it's sort of been good the last 10 years where Carlton haven't been nearly as good, but then Port Melbourne sort of lifted up and they've been really good and competitive. So I sort of get the best of both worlds there. Uh, I used to use because my Carlton membership gets me free entry to the Carlton affiliated VFL games. So I'd take all my Port Melbourne gear, but my Carlton membership and get in for free to the to the Carlton games as well.
That's awesome.
Yeah, no, it's yeah. So even at VFL level, even when Carlton plays Port Melbourne, I'm a Port Melbourne supporter. But yeah, at AFL level, I'd yeah just go for the Blues. As for their AFLW side, I keep tabs on them, but I don't think the clubs run the AFLW side very well. Every time we seem to it's hard to follow a new team when the players you get attached to leave, and it's been a very big issue for the Carlton AFLW side. I really like Jess and Sarah Hoskin, and they left. Taylor Harris has left. just recently Maddie left. She went to Essendon, which I think was always going to happen. I think the
Mhm.
AFL expanded the AFLW too quickly because the newer teams got to steal players that had only been with the team for a couple of years, which caused this movement issue. So I do support the AFLW side, but I find it really hard to get into, not through any fault of any of the players. I
Mhm.
think the club's just done a very poor job there.
Yep. And you're not the first person that says that. I have a few AFLW huge AFLW fans that are Carlton supporters that they've expressed the same thing. And I think I'm hoping now that we've got all 18 sides that it kind of settles a little bit. But unfortunately,
Yep.
I do see the grievance with some of these teams because they got, I mean, you hate saying it, they got gutted or they got raided these last
Mm.
couple of seasons because of the brand new four. So I'm hoping maybe over these next couple of years it kind of evens out and you can sit here and go, there's no more new teams going to come in unless Tazzy comes in, but I think that's a ways away. We won't we
Yeah,
won't we won't
that's
discuss that particular topic on
yep.
this one, but it is. I 100% agree with you. It is very frustrating for the people that are trying to attach to it because you can't really
Mm.
you don't want to attach to somebody and then 2 years later they're going to another team because hey,
Yeah.
there's four new expansion teams, so there's five players off your list that go play for somebody else. So 100% agree with you. I'm hoping that everything goes well, but I think for your at least for both of those sides, you got some up and coming superstars on both your AFL and your
Mm.
AFLW list. I think they're going to be so much fun to watch for sure. All righty, jumping from that, and again, with you being Victorian, this next question will be fun because I love this answer. With you being Victorian, 2020, 2021, the grand final found itself outside of Victorian soil for the first time. Plays in the GABA, plays out west in Optus Stadium. So I have to ask this. I was shocked, relatively surprised when Melbourne media started talking about should the grand final move to a traveling grand final, a lot like the Super Bowl over here in the States, like with the NFL. The Super Bowl is not in the same stadium every year, it's always moving. I know the MCC has this long ass contract. I understand that, but it is kind of something interesting to talk about. And everybody's got a different opinion. Nobody's 100% correct because I honestly think this contract is going to be just fine. So, thoughts on that? Would you be okay with a traveling grand final, or are you kind of the tradition of it must be at the MCG?
Yeah, it is a tricky one because I'm a very logical thinker, so I can definitely see the appeal in moving it like Perth having it because they've got a very nice stadium out there at the moment. The only problem is the MCG is the largest stadium and it
Mm-hmm.
fills every single year for the grand final. There's I know that they talk about the Victorian teams having a home field advantage, but on grand final day when it's that filled with that many people and Victorian teams all share 10 teams share that ground, so it's not much of a home field advantage, especially at that time of year when it's a bit warmer as well. It's not like you have Queensland teams coming down to the cold. So having said all of that, it's if it was say a stadium that's owned by one team and it was always there and that one team had an unfair advantage because of that, I would be much more like, yeah, we need to move this along. But
Mm-hmm.
given the fact that it's a shared ground by 10 teams already, I think staying in Melbourne, because grand final day, they've got the grand final parade on the Friday the day before. They've got if you go into the city on a grand final day, even hours and hours after the game, it's just different because there's 100,000 people that have just been at the ground. A lot of them have come from interstate. So I prefer it to stay there. I can definitely see the argument for it moving, but it's just one of those things, I guess, that is always going to be you're going to have people agreeing and disagreeing and arguing about it. Definitely.
Well, and like I said, there's no perfect answer. I 100% understand both sides. Like I understand the tradition, but then again, no, you could almost argue the original tradition wasn't the MCG because the MCG hasn't always been there. It's been a different park, so it's one of those.
Mm-hmm.
I understand it, and again, maybe it's also the fact that I support a non-Victorian team, so I can see the benefit of Victorians, there's 10 teams there. It's so much easier for them to get there where like say a West Coast Eagle or Fremantle fan, if they make a grand final, that's a long travel. It's a fun pilgrimage for some, but you just never know. So like I said, the 50-year contract I think is gonna make it all moot anyways. I don't think it's going anywhere. I think it's at the MCG for now, as long mostly through most of our lifetimes. But it's an interesting thought process, especially considering it was Victorian media that I heard bandering this topic about. Like, should we? And I was like, It's an interesting thought process. I don't think it's going anywhere. I think the one that everybody has discussed that I think is still up for grabs is the time, which then again, though, it can provide some visceral reactions for some people. Some people are like, it must
I feel very
stay in
strongly
the
about it.
afternoon. And I 100% understand that. And I've had discussions. I just my gut feeling, and this again, this is a gut feeling. This is not how I feel. This is a gut feeling. My gut feeling is this new TV deal, the executives want more money through advertising, and they're going to get more advertising dollars the later the game starts. And again, I I don't know why. It's just the gut feeling that I have. Maybe it was because they saw the GABA game and they saw the Optus game and both were at prime time. So they have that argument that look at the ratings. The ratings were higher. And then you have to, well, the ratings are higher. Everybody's home. Well, not all of the states were home. So, and you don't have to watch it. So, especially if your team wasn't there, everybody wanted to watch it. There's tons of different arguments there. So, in whatever, most likely you're at 2:30 because you're so used to it, correct?
Yeah, not just that. It's the whole. So there's a thing as well called the grand final breakfast.
Hmm.
So if your team's in it, you can go attend the grand final breakfast. You can buy tickets to it. There's you get up in the morning, you go into the city, you do all that sort of stuff. Or if you're at home, which is what I always used to do because my birthday's in September, so I used to not have anything for my birthday and wait till grand final day and have a barbecue at my place. So everyone rocks up about 1:30, 2 o'clock for the barbecue. Then the game's over before dinner time, and then you can get on with your night and all the rest of it. You can go into the city if you want. You can do all the rest of it. When it was on later, it just felt hard to wait all day for
Hmm.
that as well. It just yeah. But I understand your point, and I do. Unfortunately, while I'm a 2:30 person, I'd even be happy with 3:30 pushing to 4 o'clock to get that twilight
The
aspect if they
twilights.
want to
Yep.
do that because I
Where you
don't
get the
think
trans.
that's
Yep.
too late. I think 7 o'clock's too late for a start time for a grand final
Hmm.
because they want it to be a family thing and the kids aren't going to stay up that late every year to watch it is another aspect. But I do see your point, and I reckon you're right. I reckon they're going to try and move it to be in prime time for the other states to get more eyeballs on the TV.
Hmm.
But I'll just keep fighting it.
And I 100% understand. And I had a few visceral when I put that my gut feeling out there, and they're like, "Da-da-da," and I'm like, I understand. In fact, as an American, I like the 2:30 because it's at 11:30 p.m. my time Friday night. That's perfectly fine. That's not too late. The game's over by 2. I'm kind of used to it. I know the later the game starts, the earlier AM for me, it's going to start over here, which is going to be so much like the 7 p.m. games. That's like 4 in the morning for me. So personally, I like the 2:30 because it at least makes sense. I can get 11:30 to 2. That's perfectly fine. The 4 a.m. start, like those get like the GABA game, I had to wake up at 3:50 to be up to
Yeah,
give me
I do
10
that
minutes
for
to kind of wake up before the game started
yeah.
at 4. So I but I'm one of those. I see that the money again, money is king, unfortunately, and 100% understand it. But it's one of those. And then the family argument, I say it like this is you're an NFL fan. What day of the week over here in the States is the Super Bowl? A Sunday. And what is the first day of the normal work week? A Monday. At least with you guys, you have your finals, the Super Bowl, on a Saturday. So you have Sunday to sleep in. So it's like the kid argument, I 100% understand, but it's one day a year that the kids can stay up for, like, if the game did start that late, let the kids stay up. They can sleep in on Sunday.
Oh,
Everything's fine. So that's kind of my reverse
yeah,
argument
I
again.
wasn't meaning that the parents would put them to bed. It's that if it finishes too late because they have a longer halftime, that
Very
they'll
true.
fall asleep on their own.
That's very true. And again, I hate the long halftime. Anybody that's listened to mine, I hate the Super
Yeah.
Bowl halftime. I think it's ridiculous. Give them 15 minutes, let the coaches make adjustment. Let's play footy again. I hate when the
Mm-hmm.
halftime is as long as the first half and half of the second half combined. That's annoying to me.
Yeah, yeah. We don't need a halftime show. The halftime is for going to the toilet and grabbing some more snacks, so you
or
can
or
come
the
back
or
for
the
the
or the
third quarter.
sprint or whatever thing that they had there for the longest
Yeah,
time. So
yeah.
alrighty, we'll jump off that to something a little bit more recent. In actually this upcoming round, the AFL has announced Gather Round again. Whether or not I like the name, I'm not going to get into that conjecture, but they are doing an NRL style Magic Round in South Australia this year, And it's very interesting. All 9 games are going to be in SA, most of them at the Adelaide Oval, and a few is dispersed around Adelaide and one in country Adelaide. What are your thoughts on that? And are you thinking about going to Gather Round this year?
I've been to Adelaide a few times. I actually really, really like Adelaide. It's a beautiful place, and every time I've been there, I've stayed there. Last time I went there, I actually went out of my way to go to Port Adelaide's ground, where all their history is, and sit in the bar there and have a drink. So I like all of that. I haven't fully looked into the reasoning behind for doing this all in South Australia. It just seemed a little bit odd to me. I don't mind just because we have interstate games all the time. So to me, it's just another interstate game.
Mhm.
I think it's a shame because I think North Melbourne, Port Adelaide is one of those games being played at a smaller ground. And you're going to have that grudge match because North Melbourne just lost that player to Port Adelaide as well. So I
Mhm.
would have liked to have seen that get played. I think that would have warranted a bigger crowd. But yeah, I don't mind it. I just don't understand why they did it. I guess is my thing on it, but it is what it is.
Yeah, everything that I hear is that they loved the Magic Round type of feel to where you had all the games in one area, so you could kind of bring fans from all of the different Western Australia, Queensland, New
Mm.
South Wales, Victoria, SA, all into one place and have them be able to kind of celebrate footy, shall we say, not like the
Mm-hmm.
NRL footy, but footy for footy fans in that situation. Because the original 2 markets were Sydney, New South Wales, and South Australia / Adelaide. And the SA Premier basically said, yeah, if you take it to New South Wales and it bombs, we're not going to want it. So he kind of threatened a little bit the AFL, and the AFL kind of blinked and decided to go SA. I'm interested to see, will he regret that? Because I've asked this. I know SA is huge footy mad, but what if it bombs in SA? Then what?
Yeah, I get that, and I don't know because I don't know what's going on with the Sandful. So over there, they're very, very
The
much
Sample
into
has a bye
Sandful.
week that week. I listened
Yeah,
to I
so I
listened
think
to a rush hour there, and they said that, and the
yeah,
Sample teams are not happy about it.
yeah. So it is interesting because they are very footy mad over there. I hope it works just and people do come in because I think Adelaide's a beautiful city and it'll be great
Mm-hmm.
for the area. So that aspect, I hope it succeeds from. But yeah, it's just one of those things, I guess, because I don't know if the local Sandful people will go watch 2 Victorian teams because there's
Mm-hmm.
always been such this grudge between the South Australian football fans and the Victorian football fans to the
Mm-hmm.
point where it's actually called the Sandful. So then the VFL couldn't use national when they were changing to be an Australian league, which is what the end comes from.
Yep. No,
So it's just
one.
bitter.
Yeah, and I can understand it. And they argue that which one's the home of football, and when then WA starts hollering too. So it's it's
Yeah, well, there's
very
even a
interesting.
player in the '90s who got traded to Adelaide, and he had his car registration he hadn't renewed because it was still valid, so he had Victorian plates. But he just moved over to Adelaide, and he parked his car outside the ground to go play for the Crows. I'm pretty sure he was playing for at this point in time. And when he came out after the game, they'd keyed his car because it had Victorian plates because they thought he was an interstate supporter attending a game in Adelaide,
Mhm.
but he actually plays for the Crows.
Oh boy. Oh, always so much fun. Yeah, the fighting between them two is actually for sure. So yeah, I'm interested to see it. I really do think SA will support it, but that is my one worry. My worry is the SA, they're like, nah, we just want to see Adelaide and Port. Bugger all you the others.
Yeah.
That's my only worry. That really is my only worry on that.
Yeah,
So
I'd just be worried about it bombing in Sydney because Sydney's got a lot of people and they're very,
exactly.
very staunch NRL. So I think while it might bomb in Adelaide because of the whole, it's a Sandful buy round and they don't want to do that. And so
Hmm.
they might not go just to leave protect their Sandful.
Hmm.
Um, I think there's a bigger chance of it bombing in New South Wales just because they're all NRL people.
Yep, and I've heard that argument too, and 100% understand it. So already, so we'll jump to it. Some of my last questions are a lot of fun because I'm trying to do some research because, as I told many, I still haven't been to Australia. It is on my bucket list. I plan on going. I want to get to the SCG. I want to get to the MCG. I'm doing some research. The next couple of questions, I want you to let me know a little bit about what I should expect. Americans, we love our food and we love our food at our sporting events. So I got to ask, as a footy fan, what is your go-to food when you go to the footy?
So a lot of people say the meat pie. but I reckon there's these little vans outside of the grounds, and they do
Hmm.
these hot jam donuts, and you have
Hmm.
to get a bag of those. You have to
I've
get a bag
heard
of hot
that.
jam donuts.
I've heard that the hot
Yeah.
jam donuts are absolutely to die for. I've heard that is another one. So, and you being in Victoria, you've got both Marvel and you've got the MCG. Where is your ideal place to sit when you go to the footy?
So it actually depends on which ground we're at. So
Mm,
with my membership, with our home games at the MCG, we get a level two seat, which has got the best viewing angle across the
mm-hmm,
ground. It's the premium seat area, and we're luckily enough we got little cup holders on our seats, and we've been sitting with the people in our bay that we sit with, all the regulars, for the last 10 plus years. So we all know each other. So it's just good fun sitting in there together when we're winning and everything like that. So that's my favorite spot to sit at the footy, regardless of where it is. If you go down to Marvel, then I've got the same setup, but I the people around me I find a little bit annoying, which is through no fault of their own. They're not doing anything wrong. I just they're just annoying, I think. So we found out that with our membership, we can go and sit down next to the cheer squad. So at Marvel home games, I'm sitting on the bottom level between the point post and the goal post next to the
mm,
cheer squad. Uh, However close I can get when I rock up. So usually like 4 rows back from the fence.
awesome.
I sit for Marble.
Oh,
And even at Port Melbourne at North Port Oval, I've got my spot, and it's right between the 50 and the point post. When you walk in the gate, you're sort of the grounds to your right, so you got that wing,
mhm.
and yeah, between the 50 and the point post, there's a spot right on the fence under a street light, right between where they sell the beer and where the toilet is, and I just land right there.
That's perfect. Easy to get a drink, easy to go to
Yeah.
the restroom. That is fantastic. Awesome. And then the last question that I have prepared here, and I love this one because it's so much fun because there's so many different answers, especially being a footy head. Favorite game of footy you've ever seen live, television, whether you're at the ground, whether you're watching it on TV. Favorite game of footy you've ever seen.
There's a few just because I've been so into, as I mentioned earlier, the 2017 Port Melbourne Grand Final I think is the greatest thing I'll ever see in any sport. Second to that, in 1999 when Carlton beat Essendon in the prelim by 1 point, to because Essendon was such heavy favourites, and back then the top eight used to work differently. First would play eighth, second would play seventh, and so on. And the top two losing teams would get a second chance. And Carlton finished sixth and lost by about 10 goals, but first to fourth won, and they got a second chance. So they were meant to play West Coast in Perth, and then that game got moved because the AFL had a contract that X amount of games had to be played in Melbourne. So they actually made West Coast play Carlton at the MCG for their home game. And we won by about 5 points in a huge upset that we shouldn't have. So we limped into the Essendon game, who were first on the ladder, and they were meant to belt us by so much that we won the opening tap, ruck tap, and everyone cheered because we thought that's the only time we'd touch the ball. We ended up winning the game by a point and eliminating Essendon. And that's such a big, I reckon that's one of the biggest upsets ever. And it's such a big moment that Essendon team went home that week after the grand final, watching us get smashed in the grand final because we weren't good enough. And they started their preseason that day on the day of the grand final for the 2000 season. The
Mhm.
2000 season is the greatest season anyone's ever had by Essendon. They did really well, but they were spurred on by it because we beat them in 99. In 2001, they threw a game to stop us from finishing fourth because they were still scared of playing us in the finals
Wow.
because of what we did to them in 99.
That's nuts. That is absolutely nuts. That is crazy. Wow.
Yeah.
Wow. 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 It shows you a little bit of motivation, but that's fantastic that you have that great memory there. So that is awesome. Well, Tim, this has been an absolutely fantastic conversation. That is it for my questions. I really appreciate that you came on here. And again, I love that I get to find out about a state league side because again, I don't have as much connections to it. I plan on really diving into the state leagues this upcoming season because I think it's good to see some of the young and up and coming teams and players, especially who potentially could find themselves maybe in the AFL as well. So thank you again for joining me today, sir.
Yeah. Thanks for having me. It's been great.
Alrighty, alrighty. And that is going to do it for our episode, ladies and gentlemen. Keep an eye on it. We are going to have more episodes out again. AFL, VFL, Sandful, and Waffle supporters are going to be sitting down and having a chat with me. Keep an eye out, and we will be back again very soon.